Our next presenter is Mike Ryan. He is a senior research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab at Colorado State University and an emeritus research ecologist for the USDA Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station at Fort Collins, Colorado. His research focuses on landscape studies of the forest carbon cycle and the role of whole tree physiology in forest carbon balance and productivity. Please welcome Mike Ryan.
Okay, so courtesy of Jack's Pizza, I got a prop last night. Jack's Pizza was really good. And I'd like to start this talk with a question for the audience. So the question is, what percentage of this piece of wood comes from the atmosphere? And I'd like to give you three choices and see a show of hands. Simple question. What percentage comes from the atmosphere? Okay, first, about half. Okay, second choice, almost none. Okay, third choice, almost all. Well, this is great. This is, that's the correct answer, almost none. When you put this in a fireplace and you have ashes left, that's what comes out of the soil. Everything else comes from the atmosphere. So trees are carbon removal systems for moving carbon out of the atmosphere into biomass. Okay, good. That's the best. You guys know what you're doing. So in my talk today, I'm going to go through some of the basics of carbon cycling, where we are in the U.S., where we are in the Rocky Mountains, and what implications that has. So 5 basic concepts you have to understand with forests. Forests have a carbon cycle. If you look at this is an ecosystem I've worked a lot with. It happens to be a very prolific regenerating species, lodgepole pine. And it starts with a disturbance, a stand replacing fire. You get regeneration. And the forest grows up, it gets old, and then you have another fire. So there's some gains and losses within that cycle, but if you look at the whole cycle, the net carbon balance for that is 0. That's the first concept. So what that really means is that if you have a disturbance and you have regeneration, that ecosystem will recover all of that carbon lost if you have enough time before the next disturbance. So the 2 key concepts here are regeneration and also time. The next concept is that the growth, the uptake of carbon out of the atmosphere into wood, depends on the forest age. Young trees take carbon out of the atmosphere more quickly, but they're not very big, so they don't have that much in storage. Older forests take carbon out of the atmosphere a lot more slowly, but they store a lot of carbon. And you can't cut old forests or disturb old forests without disturbing that carbon storage. The next concept is that in a management context, it doesn't make sense to look at the forest carbon from the standpoint of an individual location or stand. The larger the landscape, the larger the area that you're considering, the more variability you'll have among individuals in different parts of this boom and bust cycle, and the more stable the carbon will seem. So if you're gonna evaluate carbon consequences of your management, you ought to be looking at a very large landscape or regional scale, not an individual stand scale. Because almost everything you do on an individual stand scale is going to have a huge impact on the carbon balance of that individual stand. The last concept, from a global perspective, from a U.S. perspective, clearing for agriculture and wood, and then recovery and regrowth are the largest factors. It's basically taking the system out of that cycle that I told you that has a zero net carbon balance and putting it into a different state. This happens to be a random Bing Maps, I think it is, a snapshot of northern Ohio. And you can see there's been a lot of clearing for agriculture. All of this used to be forest. Now some of it isn't. Some of that used to be cleared and now it's back in forest. So those are the biggest factors that really influence the forest carbon balance. So if you add up all this across the country, and we happen to have probably the world's best forest inventory system in the United States with over 100,000 plots in the lower 48 that you can assess both this land use changes and also forest growth. You can see that you add it all up, and over the last decades, forest growth has been offsetting about 10% or more of our fossil fuel carbon outputs. So the big bar up there is the carbon outputs that we're generating mostly from burning coal and petroleum. And forest growth is taking up a little bit of that. Well, it's not just a little bit. That 10% is it's a huge number. It's a huge number. If you look at what that number really means in terms of what else we would have to do to get that ecosystem service, basically we could do one of two things. We could do a lot of things, but two things are really bring this point home. We could change every automobile in the United States so it got 50 miles a gallon, like a hybrid, or we can convert an area of about 1/3 of our agricultural production to forests. 6 times the area of Colorado. Those are really big things. If we wanted to actually get forests to do more, we'd have to reforest 1/3 of our agricultural land. So, knowing the concepts that I talked about a couple of minutes ago, you begin to think, well, if we have a carbon sink now, gosh, maybe we had a carbon source in the past. And sure enough, if you look at the forest carbon history for the U.S., the early part of our country was a period of heavy wood use, clearing for agriculture. Our economy was dependent on wood. So at the peak, our emissions from the forest sector were about a third of our current U.S. carbon emissions. That's a lot. So what happened to turn the corner in 1915? We started using fossil fuels. So after that, it's a nice picture this time of year in New Hampshire. All of this landscape had been cleared by early settlers. In this part of the country, it was for pasture, but a lot of that, on flatter ground was cleared for crops. They left for the Midwest. They left for greener pastures. This, the forests in the northeastern U.S. have mostly rapidly recovered from past land clearing. So it's these macro trends that really make a big difference in our carbon balance. So the question is, if you look at where we are now, it's a sink. How long is that going to last? Well, it could last until we've recovered all we had before we started clearing land. But if you look at the numbers, forests have recovered about 40% of what we lost in this period of heavy wood use and land use change. But if you look at all of our agricultural land east of the Mississippi, that used to be forests, it's not likely to return to forests. We're probably not going to give up growing food, raising animals, just to get more forest cover. If that happens, it'll likely be economic trends that dictate that. We have a couple of factors that may increase our sink. We have increased nitrogen deposition, and most forest ecosystems are benefit from nitrogen fertilization. And we have carbon dioxide, which will increase tree growth if they have enough resources to use it. But we've also got a big increase in disturbances for forests that may reduce them. And in the western U.S., the increased disturbance is probably a bigger factor than anything else that we can do. So for Rocky Mountain forests, I think the question is, we have this large reservoir of carbon in our forests. What can we do to retain it in the face of all of these disturbances? Fire, insects, drought, and also the way these current forests have developed and been managed. There is some trick to this. I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe holding it up and aiming it at there, I'm not sure. But, okay. So a lot of our forests in the western U.S., not all, but a lot of them, are what's called frequent fire forests. They developed under a fire regime where they had fires every, 5 to 50 years. These were low-intensity fires. Looks more like the panel on your left. For a lot of reasons. A lot of our current forests have developed so they're a lot denser. And this has a big impact for many disturbances. if you get a fire in an open forest, the trees are generally retained. If you get a fire in a dense forest, generally they're a crown fire. It's more common, and you don't get regeneration. These forests are also a lot more prone to bark beetle mortality and drought mortality. Each tree has access to less water in the soil, and they can dry out quicker. Can I get you guys to just switch? I'll just say next. Thank you. So, let's look what happens to carbon in a fire. Fire kills trees, but it doesn't consume them. That's, not something that, unless you walk around in woods after a fire, which is actually a interesting thing to do, that most people aren't aware of. It's the news always says fire destroyed 100,000 acres or whatever it was, but no, the trees are still there. The live trees anyway, they're full of water, they really can't burn. So fire takes away 10 to 20% of it. It takes the leaves, it takes the organic layers of the soil, the duff, and it kind of rearranges it. Next. So the key here is if you have no regeneration, like in a ponderosa pine ecosystem, for the Hayman fire in Colorado, there was a big chunk of that 140,000 acres that was burned in high severity fires with not a living ponderosa pine tree for a long ways away. And ponderosa pine seeds just don't travel very far, and they don't survive the fire. So those forests will be converted to meadow shrubland. It's a type conversion. And if you do a type conversion, you've basically lost about half the carbon that was in there. Next. So what about the future? We did a study in the northern Rockies, next, looking at what effect elevated temperatures might have on the fire cycle and the carbon balance of the northern Rockies. So here's some more climate model projections. You're basically getting a 4 to 6 degree temperature increase by 2100, but even more importantly, a few degrees in the next 30 years. Next. So if you look at the impact of that temperature change on fire presence across this landscape, basically what the models that we developed did was show that you move from something that had a fire return interval, this is lodgepole pine mostly, fire return interval of 200 to 300 years, to something that by the end of the century has a fire return interval of about 10 years. And, there's variability in between there. But basically, you're switching the system. Now, I was part of the study, and I was very skeptical that something could change this fast, this much. You ask any of my co-authors there, I was a pain in the butt for this, I just did not believe we could get that big of a change. So what I did to convince myself was to go to some long-term climate records for lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine and look what their annual differences were. Next. And lo and behold, from these long-term climate records, 100 years for these, if you change the temperature about 4 to 6 degrees C, you're not in lodgepole pine anymore, you're now in ponderosa pine. So, I don't know whether the climate models are going to be accurate for this degree of warming, but what this says is if we do get this degree of warming, it's going to be more suitable for a warmer, drier forest. Next. But if you look at how this transition is going to occur, it's likely going to occur with lots of fire. And the transition will also dump a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. It's not going to be clean and smooth. Next. So the question is, can we be proactive? Can we do something to reduce the density in these forests so that when they burn, we don't lose all the trees and convert them to meadows? Next. So from a carbon standpoint, this has a lot of drawbacks. You're going to remove about half to a third of the carbon that's in that ecosystem. And even if you burn it as a biofuel, it's still going to go into the atmosphere until regrowth takes it back out. Next. So, it's kind of a gamble from a carbon perspective. You're going to get more carbon benefit if the fire return interval, if the probability of getting fire is high. Because remember, you're treating a large portion of the landscape, but not all of that is going to burn. So the more probability you have of getting a fire, the better this plays out. The other side of that is that if you have a high fire frequency, you better have low density forests if you want to preserve those forests. Next. But another way to look at this is that these ecosystems have been providing a carbon benefit these forests have been providing a carbon benefit for the last 100 years or so. They are what I would consider oversaturated. And so we really have two choices. We can move them back and dump some carbon into the atmosphere and preserve the forests, or we can let nature take care of it and have a type change. Next. If you look at recent fires on the Front Range, you can see that it's covered a lot of area. Our fire probability has really gone up, so the gamble is probably worth it. Next. Next, please. So we really have two choices, Nature is going to take care of itself. It's going to do what it's going to do, and this is what it's going to do if we don't do anything. Next, please. Or we can take management action to reduce density and reintroduce fire. Next, please. And move these forests to something that's not that familiar to us, but is closer to what they were historically. Something that's a sustainable density. Next, please. Okay, the take-home messages. There's 5 here. Next. Forest carbon is a cycle, and they recover what's lost if they regenerate and have enough time. Next. Increased disturbance with climate change will remove our forest sink. So it's going to be, the trajectory is it's going to be part of the problem not part of the solution. Next, we can help with our management activities, particularly a focus on regeneration where we're not getting natural regeneration. It's not something I've heard a lot about in Forest Service. Next. So we need to focus on this retaining forests and rapid regeneration. And finally, next, carbon is only one ecosystem service. So I don't think it's a good idea to strictly manage for carbon. Next. And finally, if you're interested in any of this, there's a lot of resources. I just wanted to stick them here so that they would be in the record. They're available on my website. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, have you done a calculation of what price of carbon would make those treatments you're talking about viable? And is it in the range of what carbon would be in a market should it occur?
Yeah, right now those treatments cost about $1,500 an acre. It's a lot of money. We have 93 million acres that could use treatment. That's a lot of money. So I haven't done it personally. People have done it, and it looks to be about, somewhere between $30 and $60 a ton that would take to make them. That carbon price that would have to subsidize it.
So that's probably not so unrealistic considering your other services that could also probably be added.
Oh yeah, I think it's definitely doable if we decide we want to do the spend a little bit of money for that. Yeah.
It'd be a wonderful paper to write in a prominent interdisciplinary place. I don't know if it's been written, but that would be very helpful.
It's a good idea.
What those other services are.
Right.
Those of us in the West know some of them anecdotally, but I think there are quite a few in terms of water and
Right.
view sheds and biodiversity and all sorts of others.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah.
So your scenario 46 degrees was that's a high emissions track for this century. So moving forward with the prescription that you gave there assumes essentially that we don't make a lower emissions track. If that transition happens, if you stay on a high emissions path, if you're able to move to a low emissions path, that transition no longer comes down.
Yeah. This study was done with older, I think we were working on it in the late 2000s. So yeah, it is. But the one thing about that is it doesn't take very much temperature rise to generate more fires with that. If you look at the big fire years in the northern Rockies, they happened with relatively low temperature increases. So if you look at by 2050, in the next 35 years, we have seen and we are projected to see several of these very big fires like the fires in 1988. So yeah, I think the end of the century that's just conjecture, but they are very sensitive to increasing temperature. All right, thanks.